Mason Hale was broke. The single dad barely had enough money for his plane ticket home when he saw her collapse at gate 22. A woman in designer clothes was having a panic attack on the airport floor. Everyone walked past her like she didn't exist. Mason didn't hesitate. He knelt down and helped her breathe through it with the same calm voice he used when his toddler had nightmares. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't want anything in return. What he didn't know was that he'd just saved Sierra Renfield, one of the richest women in America, a billionaire who'd been drowning in her perfect life until a stranger with kind eyes pulled her back to shore. Sierra never forgot his face, and when she tracked him down weeks later, what she discovered about his struggles would change both their lives forever. But would a man with nothing accept help from a woman who had everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mason Hale's alarm clock didn't work anymore, but he didn't need it. Emma's cries at 5:30 every morning served the same purpose, cutting through the thin walls of their one-bedroom apartment like a knife through silence. He rolled out of the pull-out couch that doubled as his bed, his back protesting the cheap springs, and padded barefoot across the cold linoleum to her crib. "Morning, sunshine," he whispered, lifting his 18-month-old daughter into his arms. Her fever had broken sometime during the night, a small mercy in a life that seemed to ration them carefully. The stack of medical bills on his kitchen counter had grown thicker over the past month, each envelope a reminder of Emma's chronic respiratory condition and his inability to provide everything she needed. The apartment smelled like instant coffee and resignation. Mason had moved here after Sarah left, when Emma was 6 months old, and the diagnosis was still fresh. Sarah had looked at their daughter's medical chart like it was a death sentence, looked at Mason like he was supposed to fix it, and when he couldn't, she simply stopped looking at either of them altogether. "She needs too much," Sarah had said the morning she packed her bags. "I can't do this, Mason. I can't watch her struggle every day." But Mason could. He would. He had to. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Emma settled into her high chair, gnawing on a piece of toast that cost him 47 cents. He'd calculated the cost of everything lately, every meal, every diaper, every minute of daycare while he worked construction sites around the city. The math never added up in his favor. His phone buzzed against the counter. A text from his foreman. "Sites flooded from last night's rain. No work today." Mason stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. No work meant no pay, and no pay meant the electric company would make good on their threat to shut off his power. He looked at Emma, who was humming to herself and dropping toast crumbs to the floor, blissfully unaware that their world was held together with duct tape and stubborn hope. Meanwhile, across the city, Sierra Renfield stood in her corner office, on the 42nd floor, watching the same sunrise paint the windows of buildings that looked like toy blocks from her height. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming, but she felt none of that clarity herself. The morning briefing folder sat unopened on her mahogany desk. Stock reports, acquisition proposals, board meeting agendas. All of it felt as distant as the tiny cars moving through the streets below. Her assistant, Patricia, knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission, a habit Sierra had given up correcting years ago. "Your mother called," Patricia said, setting down a cup of coffee that cost more than Mason's weekly grocery budget. "She wants to know if you'll attend the charity gala next month." Sierra didn't look away from the window. "Which charity?" "Children's. Hospital, I think. Does it matter? It should matter." Sierra owned 3 homes, 2 jets, and a media empire that reached millions of people daily. She could write a check that would fund an entire wing of any hospital, and often did. But standing in her pristine office, surrounded by awards and accolades, she felt as empty as the apartment she went home to each night. "Tell her yes," Sierra said finally. "And Patricia, clear my schedule for lunch. You have the Hartman acquisition meeting at 1. Move it." Patricia hesitated in the doorway. In 5 years of working together, Sierra had never moved a meeting. For lunch, had rarely taken lunch at all. "Are you feeling well?" Sierra turned from the window, and for a moment Patricia saw something vulnerable in her boss's expression, something almost frightened. But then it was gone, replaced by the composed mask Sierra wore like armor. "I'm fine, just need some air." But Sierra wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for months, maybe years. The panic attacks had started small. Moments of breathlessness during board meetings, tightness in her chest when she walked into crowded rooms. Her doctor had prescribed medication, recommended therapy, suggested she take time off. None of them understood that taking time off meant being alone with thoughts she'd spent a lifetime learning to outrun. The empire she'd built was supposed to be her legacy, her contribution to the world. Instead, it felt like a beautiful prison, and she was both the warden and the only prisoner. Back in his apartment, Mason was explaining to Emma why they couldn't go to the zoo today, trying to make his disappointment sound like adventure. "We're going to have a home day," he said, bouncing her on his knee. "We'll read books and maybe take a walk to the park." Emma clapped her hands, delighted with any plan that involved her father's undivided attention. She didn't know that the zoo cost $15 they didn't have, or that the park was free and therefore their most frequent destination. To her, every day with Daddy was Christmas morning. Mason's phone rang, an unknown number with a local area code, probably another creditor, another polite voice explaining how far behind he was on something essential. He almost didn't answer. "Mr. Hale, this is Jennifer from Bright Futures Daycare. I wanted to touch base about Emma's account." His heart sank. "How much do I owe?" "Actually, that's why I'm calling. Your account shows a zero balance as of this morning. Someone made a payment to cover the next 3 months. Mason nearly dropped the phone. "I'm sorry, what?" "A payment was made anonymously. Cash. The person specifically requested that we not identify them, but they wanted Emma's care to continue uninterrupted." "There has to be some mistake." "No mistake, Mr. Hale. Emma's spot is secure through the end of the year." After Jennifer hung up, Mason sat in his kitchen chair, staring at his daughter, who was now contentedly playing with her blocks on the floor. 3 months of daycare, nearly $2,000. Who would do such a thing, and why? He thought about the woman at the airport, the way she'd looked at him when he helped her stand up after her breathing returned to normal. She'd tried to give him money then, pressing a $100 bill into his palm. He'd refused, of course. He wasn't a charity case. But this felt different. This felt like someone who understood that sometimes pride had to take a back seat to love. Emma looked up at him and smiled, her whole face lighting up with the kind of joy that only children could manufacture from thin air. In that moment, Mason made a decision that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. He was going to find out who had helped them, and he was going to pay them back. Every penny, because accepting help was one thing, but owing someone was another entirely. And Mason Hale had learned the hard way that people who helped you always wanted something in return. He just hoped he could afford whatever that something turned out to be. The eviction notice was taped to Mason's door when he returned from dropping Emma at daycare, the white paper fluttering in the morning breeze like a surrender flag. His hands shook as he peeled it away from the wood, reading the familiar legal language that boiled down to a simple truth. He had 30 days to come up with 3 months back rent or find somewhere else to live. $2,400. He might as well have been asked to produce the moon. Mason sank onto his front step, the notice crumpled in his fist. Around him, the apartment complex buzzed with the sounds of normal life. Children playing in the courtyard, someone's television too loud, the distant hum of traffic. Everything felt surreal, like he was watching his life happen to someone else. His phone buzzed with a text from his bank. "Your account balance has been updated. Available balance, $12,847.23. Mason stared at the screen, certain there was a mistake. Yesterday his balance had been negative $37. He called the automated line, punched in his account number with trembling fingers, and listened to the computerized voice confirm what the text had said. $12,847. The customer service representative was polite but unhelpful. The deposit was made via wire transfer yesterday evening. No identifying information beyond the routing number, which traces back to a corporate account. The memo line just says, "Emergency assistance." "Can you tell me which company?" "I'm sorry, sir, that information isn't available." Mason hung up and immediately called back, spoke to a different representative, got the same answer. Someone had deposited nearly $13,000 into his account, enough to cover his rent, Emma's medical bills, and keep them afloat for months. Someone who didn't want to be identified. The first emotion was relief, pure and overwhelming. Emma would have a home. The electricity would stay on. The collection calls would stop, at least for a while. The second emotion was panic. Who had this? A kind of money to throw around? What did they want in return? Mason had learned early in life that gifts this size always came with strings attached, and those strings had a way of turning into nooses when you least expected it. He thought about returning the money, but to whom, and with what justification? "Sorry, but my pride is worth more than my daughter's security." Meanwhile, Sierra sat in her office, staring at her computer screen, where the wire transfer confirmation glowed like a small victory. She'd found Mason Hale easily enough. His social security number from the airport incident report had led to employment records, which led to his address, his bank account. His entire financial life laid bare in a matter of hours. The investigation had revealed exactly what she'd expected. A good man drowning in circumstances beyond his control. Medical bills dating back to Emma's birth. A former wife who'd disappeared without a trace 6 months ago, leaving no forwarding address and no child support. A work history that showed steady employment until an injury the previous year had left him unable to take on the heaviest construction jobs. Patricia knocked and entered with the morning reports. "The Hartman acquisition papers are ready for your signature." Sierra minimized the screen. "Later. Also, your private investigator called. Something about the airport incident follow-up you requested." "What did he say?" "That the subject has received the assistance package and is actively trying to trace its source." Patricia paused, studying Sierra's face. "Should I be concerned about this?" Sierra turned back to her computer, pulling up a news article about single parents and poverty statistics. "No, it's handled." But it wasn't handled. If anything, Sierra felt more unsettled now than before she'd sent the money. She'd expected to feel satisfaction, the warm glow of having done a good deed. Instead, she felt like a voyeur, someone peering into a life she had no right to examine. The truth was, she couldn't stop thinking about Mason Hale, not because of his circumstances, but because of the way he'd looked at her in that airport. Like she was just a person, not a brand or a business opportunity or a networking contact. He'd helped her without knowing who she was, without calculating what he might gain. When was the last time someone had looked at her that way? Her phone rang. Her mother, as predictable as clockwork. "Darling, I've been thinking about the gala. You really should bring someone this time. The Williamson boy is single again, and his father—" "Mother, I'm working." "You're always working, that's the problem. A woman your age should be thinking about family, about legacy. What's the point of building an empire if there's no one to inherit it?" Sierra closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied these conversations. "I need to go. Promise me you'll think about it, about bringing someone, about finding someone worth bringing." After her mother hung up, Sierra sat in the silence of her office, 42 floors above the city, where Mason Hale was probably struggling with the same questions that plagued her. What did people want from her? And could she afford to give it to them? The difference was, Mason's concerns were about survival. Hers were about something much harder to quantify. Back in his apartment, Mason had spread every financial document he owned across his kitchen table, trying to make sense of his sudden windfall. The eviction notice lay smoothed flat beside his. Bank statements, a stark reminder of how close he'd come to losing everything. Emma was napping in her crib, giving him the quiet he needed to think. But thinking only led to more questions, and questions only led to the gnawing certainty that this money came with expectations he couldn't meet. He'd grown up in foster care, shuffled between families who saw him as a monthly check rather than a child. He'd learned early that generosity was rarely free, that people who helped you always kept score. Even Sarah, in the beginning, had made their relationship feel like a transaction, her affection in exchange for his complete devotion, her presence contingent on his ability to make her happy. When Emma got sick and Sarah left, Mason had sworn he'd never depend on anyone again. Better to struggle alone than to owe someone something you couldn't repay. But looking at the bank balance on his phone, he felt his resolve wavering. This wasn't just about him anymore. Emma deserved stability, medical care, a future that wasn't constantly threatened by the next unpaid bill. Maybe the person who'd helped them was exactly what they seemed, someone with means who wanted to help a struggling father. Maybe there were still good people in the world who acted without expecting anything in return, or maybe Mason was being naive, and this was just the first move in a game he didn't understand yet. His phone rang. Jennifer from the daycare again. Mr. Hale, I hope you don't mind me calling twice in one day, but we've had another anonymous payment. This time for Emma's medical fund. You know, the emergency account we keep for parents whose children need unexpected care. How much this time? $5,000. Specifically earmarked for Emma Hale. Mason sank into his kitchen chair, feeling like the floor had shifted beneath him. First the daycare, then his bank account, now a medical fund. Someone wasn't just helping. They were orchestrating his entire life from the shadows. Jennifer, if this person contacts you again, will you tell them I'd like to speak with them, that I'm grateful, but I need to understand what's happening? Of course, Mr. Hale. Though honestly, I hope they keep calling. Emma's lucky to have someone looking out for her. After hanging up, Mason looked around his shabby apartment, at the peeling paint and second-hand furniture, at the stack of medical bills that no longer seemed quite so threatening. Someone was looking out for Emma. Someone with enough money to change their lives without thinking twice about it. The question was whether he had the courage to let them, because accepting this help meant admitting he couldn't do it alone. It meant acknowledging that sometimes, despite everything he'd learned about people and their hidden motives, sometimes you had to trust that not everyone wanted to hurt you. Sometimes you had to let people save you, even when you didn't understand why they would want to. The business card arrived in Mason's mailbox on a Tuesday, nestled between a grocery store circular and a reminder notice from Emma's pediatrician. Helping Hands Foundation was embossed in simple black letters across cream-colored cardstock, with an address downtown and a phone number he didn't recognize. The letter that accompanied it was brief and professional. Mr. Hale, we understand you have experience in construction and project management. Our foundation is launching a community center initiative focused on supporting single-parent families. We'd like to discuss a consulting opportunity that might interest you. Please call at your earliest convenience. It was signed by someone named Margaret Stevens, Director of Operations. Mason read the letter 3 times, looking for the catch. Nobody offered consulting work to construction workers who lived in one-bedroom apartments. Nobody found you through anonymous letters unless they already knew more about you than they should. But Emma's medicine cabinet was full for the first time in months, and his rent was current, and the mysterious benefactor had gone quiet for 2 weeks. Maybe this was a coincidence. Maybe his luck was finally changing. He called the number during Emma's afternoon nap. Helping Hands Foundation. This is Margaret. This is Mason Hale. I received a letter about a consulting position. Mr. Hale, thank you so much for calling. We've been hoping to hear from you. Are you available to meet tomorrow afternoon? We're very excited about this project. The foundation's offices occupied the 15th floor of a downtown building that smelled like money and fresh coffee. Margaret Stevens turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a handshake that suggested she'd worked with her hands before sitting behind a desk. She led Mason through a suite of offices that looked too new, too perfectly appointed, like a movie set dressed to look like a real business. "We're just getting started," Margaret explained as they settled. In a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. The foundation was established 6 months ago by an anonymous donor who wanted to focus specifically on infrastructure that supports single-parent families, community centers, childcare facilities, after-school programs. And you need a construction consultant for what exactly? Margaret spread architectural plans across the conference table. "We've purchased a property in the Riverside District, a former community center that's been vacant for 3 years. The building has good bones, but it needs extensive renovation to meet our vision." Mason studied the blueprints, his trained eye automatically cataloging the scope of work involved. New electrical throughout, plumbing upgrades, structural repairs to the main gathering space. It was ambitious but doable. The kind of project that would take 8 months and a crew of skilled tradesmen. "This is a big undertaking," he said finally. "You're looking at $250,000 in renovation costs, maybe more if you run into surprises. Cost isn't our primary concern. Quality is. We want this done right, by people who understand what these families need." Margaret leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Mr. Hale, we specifically sought you out because of your background. You understand the challenges single parents face because you live them every day." There it was, the acknowledgement that they knew more about him than a simple job referral should reveal. Mason set down the blueprints, his guard rising. "How exactly did you find me?" Margaret hesitated for just a moment, long enough for Mason to catch it. "Your name came highly recommended from someone in the community, someone who was impressed by your character and work ethic." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Mason had been around enough job sites to recognize when someone was being careful with their words. "I'd like to know who recommended me, I'm afraid. They asked to remain anonymous, but I can tell you that their assessment of your qualifications was glowing." Mason wanted to push harder, but the plans in front of him represented something he'd dreamed about since Emma was born. Meaningful work that could help families like his own. The paycheck Margaret had mentioned was fair, more than fair actually, and the timeline would give him steady income through the end of the year. "What's the consulting role specifically?" "Project oversight, quality control, liaison with subcontractors. You'd essentially be our eyes and ears on site, making sure the work gets done to spec and on schedule." Margaret pulled out a contract, a folder. "The position comes with a health insurance package, by the way. Full family coverage." Mason's heart stopped. Health insurance. Emma's medical bills had been manageable recently thanks to his mysterious benefactor, but having insurance would change everything. It would mean he could take her to specialists without calculating the cost first, could say yes to treatments instead of weighing them against rent money. "I need to think about it." "Of course, take all the time you need." But as Mason rode the elevator down from the 15th floor, he was already thinking about how to arrange childcare during site visits, already mentally organizing the project timeline. The job felt too good to be true, but maybe that was exactly what it was. Just good, without any hidden agenda. 3 blocks away, Sierra sat in her car in the foundation's parking garage, watching Mason's truck pull out onto the street. She'd been there for an hour, telling herself she just wanted to make sure the meeting went well, that her investment in the Helping Hands Foundation was being properly managed. The truth was more complicated. She wanted to see him again, to watch his face when he saw the project plans, to know if he'd recognize the opportunity she was offering him. Margaret had done her job perfectly, presenting the position exactly as Sierra had instructed. Generous but not suspicious, meaningful but not obviously personal. Sierra's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. He seemed interested but cautious. "Wants time to think it over." Of course he was cautious. Mason Hale didn't seem like the type of man who accepted gifts without question, even when they were disguised as job opportunities. Sierra respected that about him, even as it complicated her plans. She'd created the Helping Hands Foundation, 3 days after sending him the money, working through lawyers and accountants to establish something that looked legitimate because it was legitimate. The community center project was real, the need was real, and Mason's qualifications were exactly what the job required. The fact that it also gave her a reason to spend time with him was just a fortunate coincidence. That evening, Mason sat at his kitchen table with Emma on his lap, both of them looking at the contract Margaret had given him. Emma couldn't read, obviously, but she seemed to sense the importance of the papers, reaching for them with sticky fingers while Mason held them just out of reach. "What do you think, sweetheart? Should Daddy take the job?" Emma babbled something that sounded like approval and clapped her hands. Mason took that as a yes. The health insurance alone was worth more than his pride. And if his mysterious benefactor and this job opportunity were connected, which his gut told him they were, maybe. It was time to stop running from help and start accepting it gracefully. He pulled out his phone and dialed the foundation's number. "Margaret, it's Mason Hale. I'd like to accept the position." "Wonderful. Can you start Monday?" "I'll be there." After hanging up, Mason looked around his apartment. Still shabby, still small, but no longer quite so precarious. Emma was healthy. His bills were current, and he had meaningful work ahead of him. Maybe his luck really was changing. He just hoped he could handle whatever came next. Mason's first week at the community center site had been productive but solitary, inspecting electrical systems, meeting with subcontractors, taking detailed notes for Margaret's weekly reports. He was beginning to think the job was exactly what it appeared to be when Sierra Renfield walked through the front door on a Thursday morning, wearing jeans and work boots that looked like they'd never seen actual work. "You must be Mason," she said, extending a hand that was softer than any contractor's he'd ever shaken. "I'm Sierra. Margaret asked me to stop by and see how things are progressing." Mason wiped his dusty palm on his shirt before accepting her handshake, trying to place her face. Something familiar about the eyes, the way she carried herself. "Are you with the foundation?" "In a way. I represent some of the donors." Sierra looked around the gutted main hall, taking in the exposed beams and piles of debris with what appeared to be genuine interest. "This is going to be beautiful when it's finished." "It has good bones," Mason agreed, falling into step beside her as she moved toward the planned childcare area. "The previous owners did quality work. Most of what we're doing is updating systems and opening up the space." Sierra paused in the doorway of what would become the toddler room, and Mason caught something in her expression, a softness that seemed out of place on someone who spoke like boardrooms and quarterly reports. "This room will serve children Emma's age." Mason's hands stilled on his clipboard. He hadn't mentioned Emma to anyone at the foundation except Margaret, and only in passing. "How do you know about my daughter?" "Margaret mentioned you're a single father. It's part of why you were selected for this position." Sierra's voice was careful, professional. "The foundation believes that people who understand the challenges firsthand make the best advocates." It was a reasonable explanation, but Mason's instincts were humming with warning signals. "What kind of donors are we talking about? Corporate sponsors, private individuals? Does it matter?" It might. Donors usually want recognition, naming rights, photo opportunities. I should know what to expect. Sierra walked to the window overlooking what would be the playground, her back to Mason. These particular donors value privacy. They're not interested in recognition. "Anonymous donors," Mason said slowly, "like the person who's been helping my family." Sierra turned around, and for a moment Mason saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. I wouldn't know anything about that, but she did know. Mason was certain of it. The way she'd paused when he mentioned Emma, the careful phrasing of her answers, The expensive clothes that didn't match her claimed role as a donor representative. Everything about this woman screamed money, real money, the kind that could pay off someone's debts without thinking twice. Sierra is fine. Sierra, can I ask you something directly? Of course. Are you the person who's been helping my family? Sierra held his gaze for a long moment, and Mason thought she might actually tell him the truth. Then her phone rang, and the